Interesting news story that actually cropped up last week, but it didn't make it into the direct for some reason, despite me being the person that broke the news. Um, Immortals of Aveum, we discussed it earlier. It is receiving FSR 3 support on consoles. Now, we had some sort of mini announcement from Ascendant Studios that something was going to be happening in that regard, but we now have firm confirmation that it is actually happening for consoles, and it will be arriving in a few short weeks. Now, FSR 3 doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get frame generation, right? Because the spatial upscaler has been rolled into that. But the developer has confirmed to us that yes, this will be the first console game to support FSR 3 frame generation. And HDR support was recently added to Immortals of Aveum 2. Question is, well, what form is this going to take on the consoles? And obviously in the past, I've done some experiments using the old version of FSR 3 on PC with console equivalent settings, console equivalent hardware rather, and came to the conclusion that you could probably do a high frame rate mode with it, but the idea of putting it up to 60 frames per second, you probably not a good idea, bearing in mind that FSR 3 kind of needs a base 60 FPS to begin with. Mm-hmm. I guess the reaction to that, Alex, was basically, well, is this going to come with FSR 3.1 spatial upscaling enhancements as well? Because this was kind of like the main reaction that we had from that story, which was, okay, yeah, this is good, but there's a lot of issues with the FSR2 support in it already.
Right. Yeah, FSR2 didn't like that game's visuals, to say the least. Oliver's talked about it before in the past. Like, you can get a good with a high enough resolution internally and with an art style and a camera movement type. Like you talked about Scorn, where it was really hard to even see that it wasn't native 4K, right? Mm-hmm. And that game's dark. The camera isn't going wild. There isn't a lot of stuff just constantly like going in front of the screen and changing things like a third person character. But with Immortals of Aveum, it was like a faster paced first person shooter with like this giant arm on the screen, always like right here.
With bad motion vectors.
With bad motion vectors. So DLSS loved it, but FSR2 definitely did not love it. Yeah, so I'm curious, if it doesn't ship with that, it doesn't solve the core like image quality issue of the game, but it would make it run smoother.
Yeah, I think ultimately we will be looking at a high frame rate mode, because I don't really see any other utilization for the technology really in the console space. And to be fair, I think it could be quite effective, but I do agree that it really would stand to benefit from those FSR 3.1 improvements in terms of spatial upscaling, because there were some issues with Immortals of Aveum. And, typically the higher your frame rate, the better TAA looks and the better reconstruction looks, but it didn't really help Aveum, and frame generation doesn't help in that regard.
It's just FSR.
It would...
Yeah, FSR2 is just not good with particle effects, and especially like these semi-transparent like white particles that the game has. Like they're like colored like blue, green, red. I think there may be another color too, but maybe even yellow. But the whole point is like when they're like semi-transparent and they have like a white center. If you look at those, all those games that have FSR2 that have particle effects like this, like Forspoken also has this issue, is particle effects don't look good with FSR2. Mm-hmm. That's one thing that FSR 3.1 hasn't said if it's changing anything there. So I'm actually curious if it'll help in those aspects. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Oliver?
What I'll say here is that I've had no contact in particular with FSR3. I've not used it myself. But I would say that I don't necessarily agree with the priorities of the studio when it comes to balancing graphics and performance on Immortals of Aveum in its existing console outings, because the existing game does not run super well last time I checked on Series X and PS5, or at least it didn't as of a couple months ago. But Series S, amusingly, does run at 60 FPS the majority of the time. And
right.
I don't know what their frame rate target would be for an FSR3 update. Obviously, I think probably their language here suggests maybe it will be unlocked. Certainly based on existing PS5 and Series X performance, I think it could be unlocked because those titles often run unlocked as well. If Series S is included, I'd be very curious to see what that implementation looks like. But my kind of overall takeaway would be like, I don't think the game is configured very well in Series X and PS5 as it stands. I think the resolution should be lowered. I think the output resolution should certainly be lowered. I think those games would do well with a bit of like fine tuning to actually achieve that 60 FPS visual target, because we know it's very achievable. It's certainly achievable on a Series S, so why not on the higher end consoles? And I just don't like games in general that are making frame rate compromises in the name of image quality, where you're having an unlocked frame rate, especially on non-VR panels. I just don't think that's a satisfying experience.
Right. I get what you're saying. The game launched with a very low resolution, but a more consistent frame rate. Then it was patched with DRS, and the DRS raised the threshold for the lower bounds, which lowered the frame rate. So, I agree. If you're going to be updating the game again with something as profound as frame generation, hopefully, if there is an FSR 3.1 implementation, they might feel the need to, again, tweak the resolution bounds and increase the base frame rate. And then you get the amplification factor of FSR 3 frame gen on top of that. But I think this does basically conclusively prove it's GPU limited, not CPU limited. And with frame gen, you typically get the highest multiplication factors when you're CPU limited. Mm-hmm. So, my gut feeling is that it's going to be a high refresh rate VRR mode, which could work quite well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Alex, I do have a question though. Do you know, so on PS5, obviously developers have visibility into this, but on Xbox, do developers even have visibility as to whether the game is using VRR or not?
I don't think so. And I think this was the reason why when we talked with Asobo about Microsoft Flight Simulator, they had to create some sort of like feedback loop when the game starts up to figure out whether or not VRR was on. And it's probably simple enough as is, but we've seen it so rarely utilized that I think it just is under the radar for a lot of developers. Just like how 40 hertz modes are so under the radar and just not existing more or less on Xbox Series X, which is a shame.
Right.
They could exist, but they don't. A lot of developers don't do it.
Plague Tale is pretty much the only game on Xbox that I think has a 40 hertz balance mode, and it's a Asobo, right? So they know when the console is running at 120 hertz because they've done the legwork to figure it out, when really it should just be a system call. And I know the reason why Microsoft did that, and it's actually a good reason. There shouldn't be specific game modes that are limited to specific resolutions or refresh rates, right? But times have moved on now, and it does make sense for a developer to know what refresh rate the console is set to.
If the system knows, that means the developer should also be able to know very, very easily. So
because we had that situation with PS4 Pro where certain game modes were only accessible if you had a 4K or 1080p TV, and that was annoying. Kind of a bit. That was a bit weird. But there's certainly reasons now to know why you should have each, whether the system is running in VRR mode or not, or 120
certainly
hertz
with frame gen. It's something where sometimes it works with VR, sometimes it doesn't. Obviously, FSR 3 in its current incarnation on PC doesn't really seem to work well with VR, but here they're saying it's a requirement. So that's a little weird, but I mean, they should have visibility into it because that's really where the future, I think, of graphics technology is going, is understanding what your display looks like and tailoring the experience to that rather than the other way around. That's my own personal
Absolutely. I mean, we had this supporter question from Greg Brown with, will the FSR 3 implementation in Immortals of Aveum have the same anti-ghosting improvements AMD recently showed off? Developers' blog post conspicuously only mentions that improvement coming to PC. You'd hope if it's coming, because this is what's happening, right? There's going to be, obviously Aveum at the moment has the initial FSR 3 implementation, which it works with VSync, but doesn't have particularly good support. In fact, practically zero support for VRR and VSync off.
The current version.
And they're upgrading the FSR 3 on PC to support that. And if the PC version is getting the anti-ghosting improvements, you would hope that the console versions are getting them too, bearing in mind they should surely be running from the same version of FSR 3. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. I mean, the thing is, the developer tweeted that, hey, Digital Foundry is going to be taking a look at that. And yes, we've been speaking to Ascendant, so we can't wait to get access to the code to see what this actually looks like. And yeah, what can I say? Really looking forward to that. And doing some latency testing as well, because we don't quite know what the solution is there right now.
Yeah, that's another thing I'm working about on consoles, because on PC, at least on NVIDIA, you have reflex, and it's forced on when you use DLSS 3 and you're in a VRR scenario, which most users, literally 98% of them probably are using DLSS 3 in this way. So what the reflex is going to do is it does multiple things. Gives the GPU control over actually like the frame rate presentation through hardware accelerated, what is it called? HAGS, hardware accelerated. You know what it is. It's that's the option in Windows. Yes. HAGS. I always forget the name of it. But yeah, it gives that. Then another thing it does is it dynamically adjusts the frame rate cap to be below full GPU utilization and to be below refresh rate. So if it's on a 120 hertz screen, it'll drop it down to like 116, 117. Like it's like an in-between number there to prevent VSync queuing. But then it also prevents like back buffers coming into existence by not allowing the GPU to ever get full utilization when it's below the refresh rate. So if you're like, say you're like at 95 FPS or 95 FPS, it won't be 95 FPS because your GPU is tapping out at 100%. It's going to be 95 FPS because your GPU is at like 95%. And they try and do that too as another latency mitigation technique. Reflex is actually a very complex piece of tech. It's pretty cool. But on console, there's nothing like that comes standard. So I'm curious what this is going to look like, because if it's all based upon just like, oh, if you hit 120 hertz, it is 120 hertz. It's not going to be latency mitigated 120 hertz. So it's going to be quite different feeling than something like DLSS 3. But once again, controllers, they're already very latency heavy devices in themselves, just the way thumbsticks work. So who knows how that actually feels for the end user.
The good news is that Aveum is actually a really good game to use with the LDAT latency sensor. There's no reason, actually, depends whether there's mouse support on the consoles, probably not. Probably have to use the high-speed camera method there. But we should be able to figure out what the latency implication of FSR3 is. But it is quite interesting that, when DLSS 3 came out, it was all about, you're getting the amplification of frame rate, but it feels like a slower game. But that argument just seems to have sort of diminished over time to the point where FSR3 games are arriving with no latency mitigation, but people are still using and enjoying the feature.
Yeah, it's totally weird how the discourse like immediately shifted. Like it was not even a quest. Like it was the biggest problem on Earth, even though there wasn't any good discussion about it. Like we never made the video that we kind of wanted to make about like what is latency actually about, because the research is every game has different latency, etc. Yeah, and then FSR 3 came out, and then people just started like injecting it into games. And they're like no latency mitigation whatsoever. They're just happy with it, so it's curious.
Yeah,
how does that happen? Yeah.
Well, funny that, isn't it?